Do, 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 do. All right. Ecology continues. We're on to the smaller lectures. This is community ecology. Last one was a population. Whoop. Let's actually get my pen. A population was all the individuals of a single species in a given area. That's a population. Now we're on to community. A community is individual or all, like, here, let me get it down, multiple different species interacting. Now, we are still in the world of the biotic. We're still talking about living things. So, a group of populations interacting. So, living close enough to interact. Continuing on, interspecific competition is a big concept in community ecology. Interspecific competition has to do with when you have multiple species competing for the same resource. So, in this case, almost certainly food. Now, this could be in the form of, if you're a plant, soil nutrients, or you can't really use food to say sunlight, but kind of fits in there, competing for access to sunlight, competing for access to soil nutrients. That's interspecific competition in plants. Interspecific competition in animals, competing for food. That's a big one. But you could also be competing for things like hides, burrows, right? There are a lot of different animals that utilize abandoned prairie dog burrows. Burrowing owls, black-footed ferrets, they're all animals that will live in abandoned prairie dog towns, and you can end up having them compete for access to that habitat, those resources. So, resources is a very general term. So now let's talk about Gauss's law regarding competitive exclusion. So, in competitive exclusion, basically, what will happen is you'll have two species compete for one resource, the same resource, and then a species that will have the species that is less competitive, will end up excluded from the resource. Its population will kind of crash. So here we have parameciums in this example. So this is Paramecium aurelia and Paramecium caudatum. And when you put them in an environment where they are competing for the same resource, both populations increase until they reach the point where there's not enough to go around. And once there's not enough to go around, it appears that Paramecium caudatum is not as able to compete for the resource as Paramecium aurelia, and Paramecium caudatum has a population crash, while Paramecium aurelia increases until we hit that slowing of growth, the logistical growth curve, and then we hit carrying capacity. And basically, Paramecium caudatum was nuked out of this, and Paramecium aurelia was able to take full advantage of the resource. And boom. Here we have Paramecium caudatum and Paramecium bursaria. Now, when you have caudatum in bursaria, basically they stratify in the test tube. And because of that, they exploit different parts of the water column. And so they reach the individual carrying capacity of their part of the environment, right? We see that exponential growth, then the logistical growth, and then carrying capacity. Logistical growth, carrying capacity. They're both able to reach the carrying capacity of their particular environment because they have very little overlap of the parts of the test tube that they occupy. So when you have two species competing for the same resource in the same area, Gauss's law of competitive exclusion is going to happen if one is less competitive than the other. The one that is less competitive will end up completely excluded from the resource. Whereas when you don't have competition for the same resource, even if you're using the same resource but occupying different areas, right? You don't have that community interaction. And so each is able to reach the carrying capacity of their individual area. There's no competitive exclusion because they're not competing for the same resource. And you can see in this P. caudatum environment here, you can see their carrying capacity is pretty similar to the carrying capacity that Paramecium aurelia had when it excluded P. caudatum. So this green here that got nuked because Paramecium aurelia was so good at occupying the resource, when aurelia isn't there, when there's no competitive exclusion, its population does, hits the carrying capacity just as effectively. So there you go. So Gauss's law is about competitive exclusion, where you have two species competing for the same resource in the same area. The less competitive. I'm not sanguine about the use of the word inferior species. When you get biology enthusiasts starting to use words like inferior, things get bad quick. Hey, come here, you. So, all right. Here's competition with seed-eating rodents, where you have rodents that compete with kangaroo rats. And so this is the number of captures of non-kangaroo rat species. This is other seed-eating rodents. So this isn't even two species competing. This is kangaroo rats competing with other seed-eating rodents. 1 v many. And when it comes to seed eating, the kangaroo rat is a real Chad. So it is able to outcompete those species pretty effectively. So in red is the number of other seed-eating rodents when you have no kangaroo rats. And then across the board, in the areas where kangaroo rats are present, all other seed-eating rodents drop. Kangaroo rats are so effective at competing for seeds that these other seed-eating rodents just get competitively excluded. You know, past 1990, you're rapidly reaching, you are reaching zero counts of other rodents in this study area. So kangaroo rats, highly competitive. When they're present, they exclude pretty much all other seed-eating rodent species. So competitive exclusion, Gauss's law. Halfway done with the lecture. One big community interaction is, of course, predation. Oliver, come here. Oh, naughty snake. Getting behind the lumbar support. Predation is when one species consumes another at its most basic. So, predation is one of those extremely strong evolutionary pressures, right? Predation is a live or die evolutionary pressure. Bad hog nose. Bad hog nose. Basically, it is a hard selector, a strong selective pressure towards behavioral adaptations against predation. So let's say it's a strong pressure towards adaptations against predation. Behavioral adaptations include taking advantage of hides. So, hiding a lot. Just simply hiding a lot is a behavioral adaptation against predation. Amount of activity. If you are shorter, if you are active for shorter periods of time, you are less susceptible to predation. So that's just a by the numbers thing. The less you're active during the time your predators are active, then the less of a chance there is for a predator to find you. So that's one of the behavioral adaptations there. So morphological adaptations. Remember, morphological is the physical body. So, the structure of the body. Coloration. Crypsis is a potential morphological adaptation against predation. If you have forgotten, crypsis or cryptic coloration is camouflage. So that's a big morphological adaptation. How about armadillos? Armadillos have armor, right? Bison have horns. You can come up with an awful lot of morphological adaptations against predation. Then there's chemical adaptations. So in a lot of brightly colored animals, we have toxins. In other words, they're poisonous. Just to remind you, if they bite you and you die, they were venomous. If you bite them and you die, they were poisonous. So, oftentimes, when an animal is able to evolve a toxin defense, they also get a morphological adaptation associated with that toxic defense. Generally, some kind of coloration that stands out and makes them more obvious. That sounds like a hilariously bad adaptation. You're poisonous, but why make yourself more obvious? Well, the answer is because after something eats and throws up and gets sick on a few of you, it's really good if they can recognize your particular species and never eat you again. So there's a hypothesis out there in the wild, hognose snakes. They eat primarily toads. So there's a hypothesis out there that they sequester toad toxin in their tissues, and that when a hognose plays dead, because one of their last-ditch defenses is to flip on their back and play dead, they're not actually trying to get a predator to think they're dead. What they are doing is showing off a very bright underbelly, right? In the wild ones, in a lot of wild hognose, this underbelly has a whole bunch of yellow splashes of color all over it. And that the hypothesis is that that is a very strong, obvious color as a cue to identify them as toxic. So, Oliver here doesn't have a lot of yellow, but he still has that super bright belly, which most snakes do not have. My garter snakes have a yellowish white cream belly. My python has a white belly. Oliver has a super dark, obvious belly, and he will show it off if worst comes to worst. So, could be a chemical defense, coloration associated with a chemical defense, which is pretty cool. All those super brightly colored tree frogs are out there eating various poisonous insects, and then sequestering the toxins of those insects. And so they're super bright, so predators can recognize them as being toxic. Like, you're too toxic to be in my life as prey. So, removing or adding predators to an environment can cause a cascading effect. So, basically, predators often are keystone species. In other words, when a predator manages their prey, when they eat their prey and essentially control their prey populations, that controls a cascade of other populations, controls pops in other species, and then that maintains the ecosystem as it is. And as it turns out, California sea otters, as I mentioned in my spring 2024 class, California sea otters eat a ton of sea urchins, and in doing so, they control the sea urchin population. Sea urchins graze on kelp, and the entire ecosystem of that California sea otter, and indeed all the oysters and fish around there, is dependent on kelp forests. And so when fur traders and oyster farmers hunted sea otters to near extinction, urchin populations exploded, and kelp forest, they ate all the kelp, and kelp forests started to disappear at alarming rates. So you had a surprising amount of industry people supporting the reintroduction of California sea otters, which is kind of fascinating, especially after their first impulse was to harvest pull up as many sea urchins as possible and chop them up and throw them back in, considering that echinoderms can regenerate their entire body from a section of the central portion. So when they did that, they just drastically increased the number of sea urchins. Anyway, that's one of the cascade effects of removing a predator. When you add a predator to a population, you can indeed get a cascade effect that leads to rapid extinction of the ecosystem. Basically, if you add a new predator that nothing is adapted to, then they can very quickly wipe out the ecosystem, right? So, boop, you can always pause and come back to this. So we're gonna just wipe this screen. Boom. So, new predator. Prey will end up having little to no adaptations, because prey evolve with their natural predators. And so the predator will wipe out the ecosystem. This is a kiwi. It is a very cute ground-dwelling bird in New Zealand, and it is critically endangered because rats arrived in New Zealand, dogs arrived in New Zealand, and cats arrived in New Zealand. And rats eat eggs, cats eat birds, dogs eat birds, right? When people brought rats, cats, and dogs, it rapidly ravaged the ecosystem in New Zealand. New Zealand, the only native mammals to New Zealand were bats. New Zealand actually broke off from the continents, broke off from Pangaea and the continent land masses before the evolution of mammals. So mammals had not yet evolved. It was that period of time where birds were adaptively radiating to occupy all the niches left behind after the rest of the dinosaurs died. And so New Zealand had this dazzling variety of bird diversity where you had all these different birds occupying all these different fascinating niches. There were moas and elephant birds, and these were massive grazers. Occupying the niches that like bison do. So they were like gentle herbivores. And so I think the Maori drove them extinct when they first arrived. And the Maori brought the first rats as well, which drove a fair number of birds to critical endangered levels. And then the Europeans brought cats and dogs. And the result is now that New Zealand tries very, very hard to murder every non-bat mammal there is. And if that sounds terrifying, let's just remember that 41% of bird species in New Zealand are extinct. So they have a pretty good reason to outright destroy every possible mammal they can get a hold of. And yeah, there are actually portions of New Zealand where they've managed to, through dedicated trapping, kill every last rat. So I feel like there's a shot within the next few decades, if the planet largely survives intact, for New Zealand to remove all the rats, which would be a massive coup, because a lot of the little unique ground-dwelling birds in New Zealand, I think it's the kekapo, is like a small dog-sized flightless parrot that cruises around. So its eggs get murder-lated by rats. Basically, all the ground nesting birds in New Zealand get their nests destroyed by rats. Yeah. If New Zealand can eliminate rats, they can reintroduce a lot of the critically endangered ground birds, which would be very cool. There's a few islands off the coast of New Zealand where they have sanctuaries where they've actually wiped out every last rat, cat, and dog, which is pretty cool. Those ground birds are actually surviving and reproducing out there. Okay, so let's talk some more about predation. Just over halfway now. How does predation create these cool cascades? Predation reduces competition for other resources. So, as I said, predation controls prey populations, and then that controls resource competition. Right? You don't see as much competitive exclusion if those rodents aren't reaching populations where they can competitively exclude each other, because there's healthy levels of predation in the ecosystem. So, it can actually support healthy predation, supports increased biodiversity. Which is pretty cool. Here we go. When you have rodents present in an ecosystem, they are going to reduce ant populations, and they are going to reduce large seed populations, right? So the rodents prefer large seeds. Yeah. And the large seeds outcompete small seeds. So rodents eat large seeds. If there's no rodents, large seeds outcompete small seeds, and small seeds go down. If the rodents are eating ants, ant population goes down. But at the same time, if rodents control large seed population and they control ant population, then small seeds flourish. Large seeds outcompete small seeds. Ants eat small seeds. So, I got you, little mans. There we go. This is an indirect effect where interactions affect a third species. So, rodents interacting with ants decrease their population and increase small seed populations. So that's our third species. That's our indirect interaction. Rodents interacting with large seeds decrease large seed populations, which then results in an increased small seed population. So again, are indirect interaction, right? So when small seed populations are healthy, ants eat them, grow in population, and endanger the small seed populations, but then rodents eat the ant populations. And rodent populations go up, ant populations go down, small seed populations go back up. All right? Rodent population goes up, eats a whole bunch of large seeds, and then you have like a direct interaction where we talked about the lynx and the snowshoe hares, where their food source goes down, and then you have a cycle of the rodent population going down. But yeah, kind of cool. So, big thing here on this diagram is easiest to think of it in small seeds, right? Rodents control the ant population goes down, small seed population goes up. Rodents control the large seed population goes down, small seed population goes up. I feel like you went to the bathroom on me. You did. Well, that's going to be stinky, but we're going to continue along. Here you go, little mans. Still taming you down. Maybe you'll be hungry soon. Not bad on my hands, just right here, right beneath my nose. At least it's not on my facial hair. So indirect interactions, think of it a little bit more simply. I started to get a little more advanced, starting to talk about the direct interactions, and then the cycles of prey, and that's where you're starting to integrate population ecology, right? But this is just indirect. So let's think of it in that simplest way possible. Okay, parasitism can also counter competition, right? Basically, parasites affect competing species differently. The easiest way to think about how parasitism can affect this is some parasites are specific to certain species. So, parasite specificity. Oh, the pin isn't working. Uh-oh. Nothing's clicking. Give it a second. Give it a second. Please. Start working. So, parasite specificity is where a parasite has evolved to exploit a single host. And so when it infects that host, it's going to have a larger effect on that host, right? It will be able to reproduce more effectively in the host, and the host will suffer greater negative consequences. So in a species competing with the host for food, let's just say, you may end up with a situation where the parasite may not infect the competitor at all, or if it infects the competitor, it has a much decreased effect because it can't breed effectively in that competitor. So, could be as simple as that. Could be as drastic as the parasite killing its host and making resource competition easier. So, parasites can affect resource competition. Oh, something happened. The next slide is all about keystone species. Oh, I did something. Can I get this working again? No, nothing's clicking. So keystone species slide is going to be like actually pretty simple because I literally went through the keystone species when I talked about the effects that you see when you add or remove a species, a predator. So specifically when I mentioned if you remove a keystone species, that California sea otter example. So that slide's going to be pretty easy. Don't make me... Oh man, I'm gonna have to crash all of PowerPoint. Task manager, details. PowerPoint.exe. Intact. All right, we're back. The one good thing about a PowerPoint crash, of course, being that I get to wash my body and my shirt of the snake. All right, and we continue along, and here's the keystone species. Species that have disproportionate effects on the environment relative to their own population. So, there are predators. A lot of predators are keystone species. We talked about the sea otters, the California sea otters, and they're preying on sea urchins and then maintaining the entire kelp forest ecosystem. Beavers, right? Beavers are also a keystone species. They literally create ecosystems. They create pond ecosystems where there weren't ponds before. This has massive consequences. Ponds that beavers build dams on generally have a few predatory fish. And so beaver ponds can be a huge environment for small fish species. And also fish fry, fish larvae. Also, ponds are, slow to stagnant water. And this is great for tadpoles. There are certain toads that basically can't live and reproduce without beaver ponds. In Alberta, Canada, right? They did a survey of frog and toad populations, measuring the health of their populations by the volume of the reproductive choruses when they're singing for mates. And so they went out and they found choruses only at beaver ponds. So, while California sea otters keep a kelp forest healthy, beavers straight create ecosystems. And beavers are a great example because if you remove them, you can cause local extinctions, right? Populations die when the keystone is absent. They have a disproportionate effect. So when the keystone is removed, large populations just straight die. So the fur trade in North America had massive consequences on stream ecosystems. because beaver dams disappeared as beavers were killed off and they became significantly more rare. So, all right, succession, slide 8 of 11. The concept of ecological succession is where ecosystems change from simple to complex, right? So you start with a simpler ecosystem here in this picture, Glacier Bay. So this is a glacier recently retreated. And you have large rocks and gravel. And then moss and microbes are going to be able to colonize these areas because they can live on the surface of large rocks and gravel. And processes like freezing rain in rocks will crack things apart. Microbes will create communities that break down things, and we'll get soil, and then we'll get new populations coming in, such as conifers, especially at high altitude. Conifer forests are some of the first large plant ecosystems to come in. You might notice this garter snake is much smaller than the last one. This is Squiggle. So, Squiggle is a younger garter snake. But he ain't gonna poop on me. All right, then lastly, we have deciduous forests moving in. So you have mixed forest ecosystems, and this is where you have like max biodiversity, and you're going to have the most complex ecosystem here. And so that is succession, where you start with a simple ecosystem and you go through stages of ecosystem change until you arrive at the most complex ecosystem. Now this that I described with a retreated glacier and a completely new niche appears. Earth uses moss. It's wildly effective. This is called primary succession. Primary succession is a dead giveaway when you have the starting environment being full of rock and gravel. So when you have land exposed after glaciers, or also new volcanic land. Right? And basically, you have to go rock, dirt, soil, and then levels of plant communities. So this is primary succession. Secondary succession is recolonization. After a disturbance. So, in the late 80s, 90s, Yellowstone basically burned down. Yellowstone National Park basically burnt to the ground. There were a series of forest fires, and boom, giant dead patches of land. So there was a massive disturbance. And then the first thing to appear were grasses and wildflowers. Now that there was sunlight available, then you started to get saplings and larger bushes. And then you started to get small trees, and then conifer trees. And then you went through the levels of succession. So primary succession is when you have a new environment appearing, new volcanic islands, new volcanic land, or land exposed after a glacier recedes. That's primary succession. Secondary succession is where a community gets wiped out after a disturbance. Floods, fires, avalanches, something wipes out the complex biodiverse ecosystem, and you have to go through stages of recolonization before you get back to the complex ecosystem. So certain plants are considered emblematic of certain stages of succession. We can actually look at certain communities of the plants there, and based on where they are, we can know if, they're going through secondary succession, stuff like that. That's kind of cool. Coconut trees are often one of the early stages of primary succession. That's kind of cool. All right, the water cycle, 9 of 11. It is pretty easy. We have the ocean. We have evaporation from the ocean. So here's 1. Here's 2. Plants, right? Plants, when they go through photosynthesis, have to open they have to undergo transpiration from the underside of the leaves, and when that happens, water evaporates. They have water loss, so that's evapotranspiration. So land plants. So there's 3. Evaporation of water from the plant communities. All right. 4. Movement of water over land by wind. 5. Precipitation over land. Right? And this gets you a couple of things. 6, runoff back to ocean. And then we also have 7, percolation into groundwater. And then back to the ocean. So it goes to surface water and it returns to the ocean, or it goes into groundwater and it goes back to the ocean. So that's pretty cool. Tropical forests are kind of cool because they're so dense with plants that a lot of the evaporation that creates rain in a tropical forest is sourced from evapotranspiration itself. So tropical forests have all your plants, and you have water loss from evapotranspiration, and then you have clouds, and then you have rain, and then that rain nourishes tropical forests. Fascinatingly, when you remove a tropical forest, deforestation produces desertification. If you come through and you chop down all these trees in a tropical forest, harvest them for logging or slash and burn for agricultural use, if you want to replant those tropical trees, they're actually going to do extremely poorly. There won't be enough tropical precipitation to keep them alive, because the majority of the rain, 90% of rainforest rain, is from evapotranspiration. Forests make their own rain. A rainforest makes its own rain. That's why after clear cutting or slashing and burning, you can end up with these tropical desert areas, and you have to go through all the steps of succession. You can't just replant tropical trees because they can't survive there anymore. It's not enough humidity, not enough moisture. You have to go through full succession to get back that forest. 10 of 11, the carbon cycle. So this is about CO2 in the atmosphere. We can start here. That's very easy. And Photosynthesis. Plants collect CO2 because 6 CO2 plus 6 H2O yields C6H12O6. So, worth noting, carbon in any compound is going to be part of that carbon cycle. So we get carbon in the plant itself. Carbon is locked up in the growth of the plant, right? And then you have critters that eat plants. They are the primary consumers. They eat the photosynthetic stuff. The ones in the ocean are eating phytoplankton. The ones on land are eating land plants. Then you have predation, so secondary plus consumers. And they eat primary consumers. And carbon is locked up in the growth of animals. Carbon locked up, so it's transferred from the producers. Photosynthetic equals producers. So the carbon is locked up in the consumers. Right? And so then producers and consumers die. And they decomp, and carbon goes back into the environment. The carbon locked up in their bodies is used in the rest of the environment. Right? So, decomposers lock up carbon in growth. So we've got carbon being passed around through this growth. Now, at the same time, cellular respiration is 6 CO2 plus 6 H... Oh, wait, I'm writing photosynthesis again. C6H12O6 plus 6O2 yields 6 CO2 plus 6 H2O. And look at that. There's our carbon dioxide, and it goes back into the atmosphere. So, decomposers undergo cellular respiration. Producers undergo cellular respiration. Consumers, primary and secondary, they all undergo cellular respiration. So, and they return carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. And so normally it's pretty balanced throughout living stuff, but humans are doing a great job burning fossil fuels and wood and getting more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere than you normally would. So this is the carbon cycle. So we're carbon-based life forms, so we lock up a bunch of carbon in our bodies, producers and consumers and decomposers, but then we also make ATP and exhale that carbon back into the atmosphere. So, not too terrible. Last slide, baby, the nitrogen cycle. Okay, so we have N2 in the atmosphere. And very few critters can use atmospheric nitrogen. Like plants, nitrogen is an important nutrient for plant growth. Plants that live in nitrogen-limited areas are going to be poor growers, short plants. They might have adaptations to supplement where their nitrogen comes from. So there are few critters that can just use atmospheric nitrogen. If those plants could just use nitrogen from the atmosphere, then the nitrogen in the soil wouldn't really matter. Luckily for us, we have nitrogen-fixing critters. So nitrogen fixers. They can use atmospheric O2, use atmospheric N2, not O2. They use atmospheric N2, and then they can transfer it to other growing things or die, and nitrogen gets into the soil. Right? So that's not so bad. Here is your terrestrial cycling of nitrogen. So, into, this is going to the left. We have nitrogen fixers in root nodules. Nitrogen can also react with environmental stuff, and you get ammonia, NH3. And then that can react with other environmental stuff and produce ammonium, NH4. And then you can have critters that use nitrites and nitrates, and they can break up that nitrogen into something useful, right? So whether you have nitrogen fixers transferring it to other critters, so for instance, nitrogen fixers are symbiotes in plant roots. Plant roots have symbiotic nitrogen fixers to provide plants with nitrogen. So almost all terrestrial plants have symbiotic fixers. And so plants get their nitrogen from their nitrogen fixation symbiotes. Carnivorous plants, by the way, they eat things. Their carnivory is an adaptation to deal with not enough nitrogen. So that's kind of cool. So, boom, bacteria fix the nitrogen, plants get it, nitrogen into the critters that eat the plants. They die, nitrogen into the decomposers, right? And it kind of all cycles around. Decomposers create nitrogenous nutrients in the ground, and then decomposers die, right? Plant roots get their nitrogen from all this new nitrogen in the soil. Right? So there you go. Not too bad. We make amino acids with our nitrogen. We die and our amino acids decompose. There's a bunch of stuff going on. So we have symbiotic nitrogen fixers in terrestrial plant roots. And then cyanobacteria in the ocean. They are photosynthesizers and nitrogen fixers. So that's pretty convenient. And then as they live and die and make amino acids, you get new nitrogen into the ocean, and it dissolves there, and it cycles through aquatic ecosystems. I think it's important to know sort of nitrogen fixers and be able to kind of describe how it goes into plant roots more than it is to know the state, the chemical type of nitrogen, nitrite NO3 and nitrate NH4, and how NO3 and NH4 cycle through the atmosphere. But key takeaways: atmospheric N2 can only be used by fixers or so fixers or bacteria that convert it into something usable. So fixers or bacteria that convert it into usable forms. So it cycles through the ecosystems, and it's not so bad. There you go. Humans, very good at releasing nitrogen into the atmosphere. A lot of those natural gas leaks produce nitrogen-based greenhouse gases that are massively more powerful at warming than carbon dioxide, so that's fun. And then we make fertilizers with our nitrogen, and in the last lecture we learned about eutrophication, so fertilizer runoff, and that can mess up ecosystems. So this one on the left, like the natural part of it is over here with aquatic nitrogen cycling, and then we have humans screwing everything up over here, and then this is the natural land nitrogen cycling. Big slide, probably worth replaying this slide a couple of times because I'm done, baby.